Welcome back, or welcome to Grateful and Full of Greatness. I'm your host, Mark Glicini. On this podcast, I sit down with guests who, in my opinion, live their lives with the pursuit of greatness in mind. This platform allows me to discuss and to explain strategies that go into reaching peak performance. This is episode number 36. My guest is a dear friend and mentor, Dr. Rob Gilbert. The most energizing teacher I've ever met, Dr. Gilbert has been a professor of sports psychology at Montclair State University, New Jersey for 43 years. He is a professional motivational speaker, author, and creator of Success Hotline, a daily 3-minute motivational message that can be listened to on Apple Podcasts or by dialing 973-743-4690. That's 973-743-4690. Dr. Gilbert is an avid storyteller, a guiding light in my life as well as thousands of other people. I'm extremely excited to have him on here to share his own story, philosophy, and perspectives on high performance. Doc, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Now, I know you have this all prepared, right? You have all the questions all prepared. But you know what we should do? There's only one thing we should talk about for an hour. There's only one thing to talk about, and what's that?
Oof, training?
No, of course not.
Momentum?
No. We're talking about peak performance. The only thing that it could undo limitations, the only thing that could enlighten your soul. What is the only thing? The only thing is stories. All we should talk about are stories. You know, what stories are, how to use the stories, how to use stories to overcome your own blockages. I mean, is there anything more important to talk about than stories?
There's not. And where I had this prepared to go was the story of your life to get started. And that was how amazing, because you very openly talk to your students about how, correct me if I'm wrong, you may have despised the classroom growing up, and now you're on fire every time you enter one. So could you talk about the story in which you were able to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I grew up in Boston, and I supposedly went to a very good school system, but there are no good school systems in America. Here's all I'm going to do is tell stories today. When I read my students' final exam last December, I felt mad and sad at the same time. She tells this story about how last weekend, she wrote, I went home and I had to get gas. So I pulled into the local gas station, and one of the kids I graduated from high school with in June was pumping gas. So he came over all excited to see me. He said, hey, what are you doing now? And she said, oh, I'm going to college. And he said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to Montclair State. He said, do you like it? She said, yeah, I love it. And she said to him, what are you doing? And he said, well, this is it. I'm working here. He said, you're not going to college? No. And are you planning on going to college? And he hung his head. He said, no. And she said, why not? And he said, I'm not one of the smart kids like you. So are you telling me after 12 years of being in a school system, the thing you learned is you're not one of the smart kids? I mean, that's a crime. I'm not one of the smart kids. Of course he is. I mean, he has the ability. He might be blocking it. He might have been talked out of it. He might have been talked down so many times that he just doesn't think there's any hope. So as you said, I didn't do well in high school. I graduated in the lower 10th of the class. In college, I failed 10 3-credit courses and flunked out of college. And then through some just sheer amazing coincidences, and I got a PhD from the same school I flunked out of. And a few years ago, I was nominated as the outstanding alumnus from the same school I flunked out of. And one of the things is you have to realize that college, high school in America has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with diligence. If you're willing to be diligent, you could do anything. But we make it seem like the smart kids do well. No, the diligent kids do well. And it's the same in sports too. You know, diligence beats intelligence, not most of the time, every single time. And the higher you go up from, undergraduate to graduate to master's to PhD, diligence is even more important. So I tell my students very openly about how poorly I did in school, not so I could make fun of myself, but then to give them an acronym which called HOPE, HOPE. That stands for hold on, possibilities exist. If I could tell them how I flunked out of school, if I could tell them how poorly I did, when they're at a crossroads and when they're thinking, oh my God, am I going to make it? They'll say, well, Dr. Gilbert did it, you know? And how do you give people hope? What's the best way to give people hope? HOPE, hold on, possibility exists. The best way to give people hope is another HOPE, is hearing other people's experiences by telling them a story. So when I tell them my story, I'm doing more than telling them my story. I'm giving them hope. And the thing I know, if I give them facts, like I graduated from UMass with a 1.92, I failed 10 3-credit courses, the facts fade, but the stories stick. They will remember my story. They won't remember the facts and what my major was and all that. So I can't think of anything more important to talk about than just stories, stories, stories.
So you're talking about how the school system kind of failed you. Would you say that kind of transition from you, not really loving school to where you're at now, we're all in the first time you were on this podcast, you said you think about teaching all the time, right? When did that gap happen? When you go inside of that story, was it chronic? Was it like an aha moment where things changed for you? Or do you feel as if it was slow and gradual?
Well, first of all, I don't want to think everybody think that I'm really being critical of the Boston school system and what I went through. I think what I went through is the greatest gift I ever got because I became the teacher I wish I had. I became the teacher I wish I had, and all the negative experiences, I couldn't do what I'm doing now. Like I wrote a book called How to Have Fun Without Failing Out, and I really couldn't have written that book unless I flunked out of college. So, the worst things often turn out to be the best things. Our biggest breakdowns lead to our biggest breakthroughs. Our biggest weaknesses lead to our biggest strengths. So, I'm pretty happy with my career. And am I on fire? Well, I think my job. I don't think my job is to teach sports psychology. I think my job is to change the world by motivating people. Now, yeah, before people out there think I'm delusional, I think that I am changing the world through my classes. Cognitively, I know I'm not, but my belief is that I am. And that's what keeps me going.
Mm.
So nobody could steal my beliefs from me. You could steal, you say, okay, show us an email from a student whose life's been changed. I'd have trouble coming up with that email. But every day I feel like, okay, I mean, I don't know if I made a difference in this person's life, but he still remembers me. There was a kid when I was running my all-day seminars in sports psychology called the Winners Workshops. And I don't know, this must have been maybe the late 80s, early 90s. And there was an All-American high school football player that came to my class, and I know he came to my seminar, I should say, and I know he got something out of my seminar because to this day, he still uses some of the stuff I did. The one raise your hand as high as you can and get a quarter-inch higher. So what I do, I say, okay, everybody stand up. We're going to talk about peak performance. Everybody raise your left hand as high as you can. Get as high as you can, as high as you can, as high as you can, as high as you can. Okay, freeze. Now that your left hand is high as you can get it, I want you to do the impossible. Raise your left hand a quarter of an inch higher. And everybody does it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a U.S. senator who uses that in all of his speeches. His name is Cory Booker. And he came to my class when he was at Old Tappan in 19. He was a junior or senior at Old Tappan. He came with his brother. So the thing is, every once in a while, you hit pay dirt, but it really doesn't matter because I know I'm telling my kids exactly what they need to hear. I'm telling them, number one, everything they need is already inside them. Number two, all the strategies they need to develop what's inside them is all around them. Number three, we have to get rid of or not listen to this little voice in our mind that says things like, oh, I don't feel like it. Oh, I don't want to do it. And number four, we have to overcome a myth that says such a thing is failure. There's no failure, just feedback. There's no winning and losing, just winning and learning.
Mm-hmm.
Winners lose more than losers lose. So
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. So I could talk about this. I've been talking about this for 40 years. I could talk about this for 40 more years. I'll never get sick of talking about it because I think it's exactly what athletes have to hear, exactly what performers have to hear, and exactly what people have to hear.
So basically, when you talk like that, you're speaking to the young coaches, the parents, the leaders of the next generation. you said something inside of facts fade, stories stick. And what would you say to the aspiring coach or young parent on how to become a better storyteller? Where do they start?
Oh, well, first of all, they're already a good storyteller. So, Mark, you think of all the skills you have. You're a highly developed athlete. You're, highly evolved fitness. I mean, you have a million things going for you. And I would say better than your stick work in lacrosse. I would say that you are probably better at as a storyteller because we've been practicing storytelling our whole life. We can't name a name a 2 hour period in your life you haven't told a story. You know? Okay, hey Mark. Your mother says, "Hey Mark, did you go to the store?" You don't say no. You say, "Oh, I didn't go to the store because," and you tell a story. Hey Mark, did you take a dog for the walk? No, I didn't take the dogs for a walk because we're evolved storytellers.
Mm,
Uh, the Muriel Rukeyser said the universe is not made of atoms; it's made of stories.
mm,
And somebody once said, "Why did God make so many people? Because He loves stories." So we're telling stories all the time. So the young coach, they know how to tell stories, but they might not have the best stories. I
mm,
want to hear a great story. In ancient or in olden times, there was a husband and wife, and they were both blind, they were both poor, and they were both childless. But they were both very, very, very religious. They prayed every single day. And one afternoon, an angel came to their door. And they couldn't see the angel, but they could feel his presence. And he said that he was an angel from the Lord. And the Lord had noticed how devout they both were. And the Lord was going to grant them one wish and only one wish, but they had to tell the angel the wish right then. And of course, the husband and wife were dumbfounded. Um, and the husband says, "Angel, this isn't the wish, it's just a request. Could you give us 24 hours to come up with our wish?" And the angel said they would. 24 hours later, after conferring all night, the angel showed up again. He said, "Sir, do you have your wish?" Well, let me tell you what happened in the interim. In the interim, he went to his wife, which we asked for. And she said, "Well, let's ask for children. Children will make us happy forever." And then they went to their friends and they said, "Well, which we asked for?" And they said, "Oh, ask for money. Money will make you happy forever." And then they went to the religious leader, a priest, and they said, "Which we asked for?" He said, "Oh, ask for sight. Ask for sight because you have never seen anything." So now they're conflicted. And when the angel showed up, said, "Do you have your wish?" And the man says, "Yes. We wish to see our children eating off of golden plates. We wish to see our children eating off of golden plates." The husband and wife were smart enough and unblocked enough to want it all. Why
mm.
settle for one thing? One wish. One wish got everything. And of course, the angel says, "Wish granted."
See, Doc, this is something that's next level about you. Is you don't care just about the story, you care about the amazing story. When we speak, every single week, you have a new story. You found one. You've seeked it out. When did that start for you? When
Well,
did you
yeah,
start to
yeah.
go above
Well,
and
yeah,
beyond for those?
you're totally you're totally overestimating me because I'm at the stage of my life now that there are very, very few new stories. It's like archaeology. I was telling that story 25 years ago and I forgot all about it. I forgot all about that story. But you want to hear a new story? Um, do you? There's a story. I don't want to tell the story, but I wish the people listening to us would go to YouTube when we're done and put on Mr. Jensen. And there's an incredible story, a 4-minute story that's it's as perfect a story as there is. So on one of my final exams, last semester. One of the questions was Mr. Jensen. And one of the young women taking my class, she wrote in response to this, she said, "Oh, the Mr. Jensen story reminded me of my friend Rachel Ziegler." Then she went on to tell me the story of how she and Rachel grew up in Clifton, New Jersey, and they went to the Clifton public schools together. Then when it got to be seventh grade, Rachel went to, I think, parochial schools in Lodi, and they weren't together in middle school and high school. And she said, Rachel, when you see the Mr. Jensen story, you'll see that the little boy had a problem in the story, and Rachel had a problem too. Rachel loved singing. She was put on this earth to sing. And of course, when she's in class, she can't sing. So what does she do in class? She hums under her breath. And the other kids are saying, Rachel, shut up. And the teacher saying, Rachel, go to the principal again. You can't hum. You can't hum. So my student wrote, I hadn't seen Rachel in years, but I saw her last Friday night because I went to the opening of West Side Story at the Clifton Commons, and Rachel Ziegler had the role of Maria in West Side Story. Then she went on to say that Steven Spielberg had an open audition over the internet, and he told young women could send in their audition tapes. He got 30,000 audition tapes, and out of the 30,000, the kid that was a problem, the kid that hummed in class, got the role and might win the Academy Award. That's how good she is.
And Doc, this is why when we first started, I thought you'd talk about training, because maybe it's the stories inside of training, because Rachel didn't give up on the fact that she was a singer and she loved to do it. And she was a monomaniac with a mission inside of singing. So what is it about training? What is it about training inside?
Let's talk about this. Because I think Rachel's a lot like you. Do you think Rachel didn't give up, or do you think Rachel doesn't have a choice? Do you think Mark Glicini actually motivates himself? I don't think the way you train, I don't think you have a choice. I don't think there is a choice whether you should work out every day. Is there? You just have to work.
That?
Huh?
Why do you say that?
I don't think it's a choice. I think it's such a part of you. It's like my hotline. I do my hotline every day. That's not a choice. It's never crossed my mind not to do it. See, I think the ultimate interview question, and most people, when they go for most jobs, they say, well, why do you want to be a teacher? Why do you want to be a coach? Or why do you want to work on Wall Street? I think the ultimate answer is because teaching is the only thing that really makes me feel alive. Coaching is the only thing that makes me, playing lacrosse is the only thing that makes me feel alive. Training is the only thing that makes me feel alive. And I think that's the ultimate answer. So let's get back to you. So do you think that's true of you? Do you think you're like, I don't think Rachel had a choice about humming. She just had a hum, you know?
I will add this, and then I'll come back and I'll answer your question. I was watching the documentary on the alpinist, and inside of that documentary, Alex Honnold was asked, why don't you guys use a rope? You know, because any sane human being would use a rope. Yeah. And he responds by saying, that's a stupid question. And I laughed a little bit because it's true, right? There's such a high risk, there's such a danger that you could die. And what I thought about, what came to my mind is the Russian psychologist Vygotsky talks about these like 3 concentric circles in which you can start to live on the edge, and you know, you go from one zone to the next. And this is where this idea of being in the zone comes from. Doing something that makes you completely present, right? Because it's hard enough. Yeah, you love it, and there's this sense of you that's done it before, but then there's this aspect of it that you're trying to accomplish, right? So what I'm bringing up here is how present they had to be with the wall, right? If there's no rope, you have to be present with the wall. So in answering your question about Rachel and I think inside of training, I'm looking for that edge, right? And that's probably the most obsessive idea I have right now at this point in my life is being edgy, right? That's what I'm talking about with a lot of people, is be edgy, right? Whatever it is, right? For you, it's storytelling, but you want to go to another edge. You want to make somebody, because what you love about stories, Doc, is its power to change the world, right? And I love it for that exact reason too. Yeah. And can you tell the perfect story, right? I'm going to go off, and versus Ferrari. If a listener hasn't seen that, you have to see that movie, right? There's a part in that movie, Ford versus Ferrari, where the father's talking to his son, and he said, talking about how he could do the perfect lap. And his son goes, "But Dad, you can never do the perfect lap." And he says, "But son, I can try." And I like that. I like that idea of going to the edge, right? Because what makes us so human is that we want to be safe and survive, right? And reproduce and move on, right? But what also makes us human is the other side of the continuum. Get edgy, right? Go find something that's going to be perfect to you. Does that resonate?
Well, the nice thing about stories is the way our brain operates is when you tell me a story, all of a sudden the story pops up in my brain. And this is a story about a journalist who's writing a book on the highest, the best makers of fashion in the whole world. But the boutique people, boutique people that they don't make a million shirts, they make one shirt. They don't make they do it individual. So he finds the place in Italy that makes the best shirts in the world, and he meets the owner of this very small establishment, and he's asking about the history of the establishment. I said, well, there's the history right there. That's my father. He's 93 years old and he's still making shirts. And he said, well, could I speak to him? He said, well, he doesn't speak English. So they got an interpreter. And the journalist asked him, he said, well, what makes your shirt so special? What gives them the edge, so to speak? And he said, it's the way I cut the fabric. He said, how do you cut the fabric? He said, well, it's taking me a whole lifetime to learn how to do this. But I don't cut the fabric with a knife. I cut it with love.
It's so good.
Yeah.
And that's what I viewed. To give the listeners a background, when I walked away from Wall Street, I showed up at your doorstep and I took your graduate applied sports psychology class. That was something that I could tell in the first 5 minutes, first minute of being in your class, was that you really loved what you were doing, right? Mm-hmm. And you were, that's what made you come alive. Could you share, this just came to mind, how you could be sick as a dog. However, if you get a chance to be in front of people and teach and story tell, you're able to just do it. Is there a story in your life in which you could point that out, or could you share with them how that is true?
Well, one thing I know for sure is when I have like a 12 to 15 minute commute to Montclair State from where I live, and there's some days I wake up and I don't feel well, and should I teach today? Should I call in sick? What should I do? But I know the secret now. I know I go to my office, I feel even worse. I walk to class, I feel even worse. And by the time the class is over, I'm healed. So it's almost like going to a healing springs. It's almost, that's what does it for me. It gets me out of myself, and it's happened so many times. I expect it to happen now. So if I could teach, it's going to make me feel a whole lot better. Now, I hope this might happen, that I might go in the classroom and faint. It hasn't happened yet. I mean, I would say 100% of the times I go into the classroom not feeling well, I always feel better. So I'm expecting that to happen.
So that's the secret. Find what in your life is your healing spring. I like that. And Doc, your ideas and stories and quotes are endless. I'm going to challenge you here and say, maybe I'll give you two, but if you had one billboard right now in your life, what would the message be to anybody driving by or walking by? What would you want them to see in one quote or one idea?
A billboard, one quote or one idea? Well, I really like quotes, but quotes don't do it as well as stories. And I really like short stories. So since it's a billboard, and since you want people to read it, the story, it can't be too long a story. So one of the great short stories is this one. Fire, water, and trust are walking in the woods. And they're deep in the woods, and one of them yelled out, "Hey, what are we going to do if we get lost from each other?" And Fire said, "Oh, don't worry. Just look for the smoke. That's where I'll be." And Water said, "Oh, don't worry. look for the green grass. That's who I'll be. And Trust said, if you lose me, you better worry, because if you lose me, you'll never find me again.
Hmm. So
So,
trust. It would be all
and,
about trust.
and, and I've told that story in class, and every once in a while, especially there's a young woman, when she hears that story, she wipes away a tear because
Hmm.
somebody in her love life broke her trust, you know?
Yeah. Inside of your students and you being a professor for over 4 decades, could you share a story inside one of your students in which you actually were able to ignite them and you were able to get them to a place that maybe they didn't even think that they could get to?
Um, no, I mean, I don't think there's any student that I was solely responsible for them doing anything great. I mean, I could tell you a story about Michelle. And one of the things I like to talk to my students about is graduate school, because most kids, they don't realize that most graduate schools, you're paid to go to graduate school. You get a graduate assistantship one way or the other. Even with my terrible grades as an undergraduate, I still got a graduate assistantship. I was in charge of a residence hall at UMass Amherst. So anyway, one day after class, one of the students I knew pretty well, Michelle, and she was a veteran from the Air Force, and she was in her early 30s, and she had like a 3.9 grade point average, and she did her internship someplace in China. I mean, she just had unbelievable credentials. And she said, "Can I talk to you about graduate school?" I said, "Sure." I said, "Where do you want to go?" She said, "I'm applying to Kane and William Patterson, two state colleges in New Jersey, maybe state universities." And I said, "Okay, that's good, but where do you want to go?" She said, "I'm applying to Kane and William Patterson." So this went on. And I said, "I know you're applying to Kane and William Patterson, but really, where do you really, really, really want to go?" And she said, "Well, I really want to go to Teachers College, Columbia University, the top graduate school of higher education in the world." I said, "Well, you want to go there?" Well, she said, "But I won't apply. I'll never get in." And I said, "Well, apply." And I've never seen Michelle again. But 2 years later, she called me up and left me a voicemail how she got her second master's degree from Teachers College, Columbia University. So
Hmm.
if I didn't say apply, who would have known? She probably, from her limited view of academia, she said, "Well, I'm only from Montclair State, and I'm older than most kids." I mean, from my point of view, there's no way she wouldn't get in. From
Hmm.
her point of view, there was no way she would get in. So luckily, the fact that she called me Dr. Gilbert, and luckily the fact that she might have looked up to me a little bit, luckily she took my advice, and luckily she got her second master's degree.
Out of people like Michelle and those that you've come across, what would you say are common threads about them, traits that they have?
What I did get? Can you repeat that again?
What would be the common traits among those like Michelle that you've seen, right? What are some things that really stick out about the person, characteristics like that, like Michelle?
You mean the ones that go on? Well, I think their growth mindset, positive attitude, open minded. Um, like today, it's a Sunday, and I run something called the Study Marathon, and on Zoom from noon to 6 every Sunday. I've been doing this for 3 or 4 years. My students get together and they study for 6 hours, which isn't easy to do. So one of my students who never came before came today, and it's still early in the semester. It's still January, and he came in. We spoke to him for a few minutes, and he said, "This is weird," and he left. I mean, you're coming to a study marathon to study. I mean, I don't know if he thought there was going to be a buffet or something. It's online, but he just, he was just something closed him down. He just had to flee. This is
Hmm.
online. It's on Zoom. You could. We don't have to see you. You just see if you could do something very difficult. Study for 6 hours straight. Very few people could do that.
Right. I do want to
But
shift in.
immediately he fled. He fled.
I do want to shift into sports psychology because it is an unknown, misunderstood, relatively or underappreciated field. What would you say is the reason why sports psychology is not mainstream, and what would it take to get there?
um, well, sports psychology. there are like as many theories in sports psychology as there are sports psychologists. It's like I have something called atrial fibrillation, and I take something called Eliquis. I would say most people that have what I have probably take Eliquis.
Mm.
But if you're suffering from something, like choking or something, and you go to 5 different sports psychologists, they'll all do something different. Well, you need to be hypnotized. You need to be waxed. You have to do affirmations. You have, so it's a very, very interesting field, and everybody knows the value of the mental part of the game. But most coaches will say how important the mental part of the game is, but they won't do any mental training with their players. And
Mm.
I'm not criticizing the coaches. Let's get back to schools. It's the same thing in school. You go to school and every night your teachers give you homework. They tell you what to study. Do they ever teach you how to study? And that's what sports psychology is. Your coaches are telling you to relax, concentrate, get motivated, but they're never telling you how to relax or how to concentrate and how to get motivated. And that's what I see as sports psychology, these how-to techniques. Don't tell me I can't, I'm just an anxious person. I can't relax. No, no, you haven't learned how to relax. Oh, I'm an insomniac. No, no, no. See, in sports, there's a physical part of the game and the mental part of the game. The thing that makes them one is they both are skills. There are physical skills, there are mental skills. A skill, the way I define a skill, is something that you could learn and get better at. And then you can keep getting better and better and better. So you could get better at stick work and lacrosse, and you could get better at relaxation. You could get better as a goalie, and you could get better at focusing. So you could train yourself.
I think one of the main hovering through lines since we started this conversation has been the underlying belief inside of things, right? What these students that say to you, well, that's not me, that's not for me, I can't do that. Who was it for you, Doc? Who was the mentor or the guiding light or the main influences in your life that said you could be someone?
Wow. Uh, Off the top of my head, I don't think well, my parents always told me I could do anything I wanted to do and I could be anything I wanted to be. So that they implanted that in me at an early age. And doing terribly in school, I knew I could do better in school. I just knew I didn't want to. I
Mm.
just didn't want to. I mean, being having an assignment on Tuesday, having a quiz on Wednesday, and never referring back to what the assignment was ever again didn't motivate me.
Mm.
I still remember my high school Shakespeare teacher. He had us read a couple of acts of extra Shakespeare, and then he'd pick out innocuous phrases, and he'd just say the phrase, and we had to say who said this to whom in the play under what circumstances. And I used to think, what if Shakespeare was sitting in the back of the room all disguised? And he saw what this teacher was doing to his masterwork. Who said this? So it was a trivia game. And
Yeah.
and now I look back and say, why didn't you share your passion for Shakespeare? Why did you make Shakespeare into a game of Trivial Pursuit? But obviously, the answer was he probably wasn't passionate about Shakespeare.
Mm.
He probably went home and read Dick Tracy novels or something.
Right.
So if you don't have the passion, you definitely can't share the passion. And then, there was a professor at Montclair State named Michael Kogan. And when I got there, people told me about Professor Kogan. Professor Kogan, without any notes, without any PowerPoints, would get up in front of the class and he'd talk about the Bible. And then when the class ended, the next class, he'd just keep going. He'd tell the story of the Bible. And people who weren't in the class showed up. See, that's how you know there's a good professor. When
Oh,
people who aren't taking the class show up for the class. As a matter
right.
of fact, I still have some of his lectures on tape. That's how good he was. And he's retired now, and he's living down south, maybe in South Carolina, Georgia. I'm not sure where. And I asked somebody that knows him, what's he doing now? And he volunteers at churches and synagogues giving lectures.
Mm.
That's it's so much a part of him. He can't not do it.
Hmm.
Being a biblical scholar, being a biblical lecturer isn't what he does, it's who he is. It's
Mm,
like,
no
like
doubt.
as an athlete, being an athlete isn't what you do, it's who you are. You can't not do that.
Sure. Many people have dreams of, the big house, the really nice car, the lots of money. When I turn that to you, what are some things that you still really want or still want to do in the coming years?
Well, it's strange. I've never, I still have a Honda Civic. I never even owned a car until I was 32 years old. When I moved to Montclair, I used to hitchhike, and people, I came from Amherst. Everybody in Amherst hitchhiked. Nobody in Montclair ever hitchhiked. I never, there was no part of me that ever lusted for anything like that. I just want to teach a good class. I want to give a
Mm,
good lecture. I mean, I want to write a good book or hear a good story and tell a good story. I mean, that's what you and I have in common because you feed me. You always have more information. You're always seeking out people, and that's what I find. That's a personality that appeals to me. Somebody that could actually feed me information and is as interested in something as I am.
right. Right. I want to pull along that thread because uh, I really do believe that being in your classroom was different than anything I've ever been in before. Right? Maybe Professor Wright at Yale was very great. I walked in and he was playing the piano upside down, and that was really interesting. Right? But when I ask you, what makes a good class versus not a good class? Because I know it's not something you think about; it's something you feel. So if I
Mm-hmm.
had to ask you that, what would you say makes a
Well,
good class?
that's very simple. It's all energy. If the students leave the class more energized than they came in, it was a good class. And they said, well, you don't show PowerPoint. It has nothing to do with information. It has to do with inspiration. Inspiration. So let me just say that correctly. It has nothing to do with information. It has to do with inspiration. And if people leave, I mean, if you're inspired, all the information's out there. I'm all the information is so accessible. Like Professor Wright, and I've gone to some of his lectures. He's a genius, and he just wrote a book on genius. And I'm sure within 15 seconds of right now, you could go to YouTube and find I think his name is Craig Wright. Is that correct?
Nice.
You do Craig Wright, Yale University genius, and you're going to find a lecture. I mean, when I was in high school, you had to go to the library and fill out a slip, and hopefully they'll have the book.
Right.
Nowadays, it's almost too easy. So anybody could become an expert on anything within a very, very short period of time if they have that inspiration, if they have that excitement, if they have that energy. And it's a fun time to be alive.
No, Doc, what's really interesting and what's coming to mind is how unstructured you make things. Right from the get of this podcast, right? No interest in going question by question. You like that freedom, and I've always appreciated that about you. And I think that's something that needs to be unlearned. As you get older, it's not so much confined and here's the fence and stay within it. And I think you'll be able to have that growth mindset if you just made the deliberate choice to unlearn, right, this structure and choose to be free. A more poignant question would be, what's the most important thing in your life that you've learned, and how did it change from what was your life before you learned it and now after you learned it? Right. I know that's along the thread of me asking you, why are you on fire in the classroom when you never were before? But what's the most important thing you'd say you've learned?
Well, I think the way I could reframe that question is, what do I know now that I wish I knew way back when?
Absolutely.
What does Rob Gilbert know at 74 that he wished he knew at 14? And when I was at 14 years old, I wanted to be the third baseman for the Red Sox. I wanted to be a really, really good musician, a really good musician, a drummer. I really wanted to do well in school, and I didn't do well in any of those things. I mean, even though my father was a professional drummer, I wasn't a good drummer, I wasn't a good student, and I wasn't a good athlete. And the thing I know now that I wish I knew then is way back then, I thought I wasn't a good athlete because I didn't have an athletic gene. You know, now I realize I didn't practice enough. Way back then, I didn't do well in school, and way back then, I thought I wasn't a smart kid. Now I realize I didn't study. It's interesting. Well, let's look at it this way. you didn't do well in school. Why didn't you do well in school? Well, I'm not smart. No, 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 you didn't study. You didn't study at all. And it's the same, even though I had a father who was a professional musician, I mean, I didn't practice. So I thought I was lacking something, and I was lacking something. I was lacking the grit. I was lacking the perseverance. And
Mm,
I was just playing this game with myself, thinking that I was lacking ability. I wasn't lacking ability. I was lacking I was overwhelmed, like, oh, I don't feel like studying. I don't feel like working out. I don't feel like practicing.
mm. You know, staying on the deeper side of things just for a second, because when you brought up the idea of flunking out of school,
Mhm.
it didn't seem too heart wrenching at the time. Maybe you can course correct me if I'm wrong. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about failure and the biggest failure you've gone through and how you've grown and shaped from that. Was it school? Was it flunking out of school, or what would you point to as one of your biggest failures that really shaped who you are today?
Flunking out of school was a big failure, considering that as soon as you flunked out of school, you were drafted. And luckily, I didn't. I didn't pass the draft physical, or I might have been in Vietnam within a few months. So that just shows how little I was motivated. I couldn't even stay in school to stay out of Vietnam. I think even when I give talks and stuff, and I'm being evaluated, and people are paying me, I just look at his practice for the next talk. I just look at his practice. Like, this is not the most important talk I'm ever going to give. It's just practice for the most important talk. So I put everything in the important zone, and I never make anything special.
Mm,
As soon as you say the 14 killer words, this is it, it's now or never, it's do or die, there's no tomorrow. As soon as you say those words, you put things in a special zone. So
mm,
everything's important. Your world champion game's important. It's not special, just important. So along with that, I have to tell a story that after President Clinton was out of office, he had a pretty serious heart operation, and it was successful, and he's doing quite well to this day. Well, that night on the news, they interviewed the head of the surgical team, the cardiac surgeon, and they said, "What was it like operating on President Clinton?" And they said, "Well, we knew it was President Clinton, but we treated him like any other patient, meaning we didn't treat him special, we made him important." So
mm,
the purpose of me telling that story is to reinforce, the important versus special. So I gave
mm.
it like more life to it rather than just saying important versus special.
Right. I'm going to probe one time on the special side of things with a question that I had lined up. And I want to ask you, because you've been enthralled with athletes from all different generations, if you could put a few athletes, alive or dead, at a dinner table with you just to have a conversation with them, and that would be a special moment. It would be a one off event. Who would be at that table?
Well, first of all, my boyhood hero, who was Ted Williams, who I only met one time in my life. I mean, I don't think any athlete in any town ever had, I guess I had to use the word charisma. I mean, the Red Sox were never ever good, especially when I was growing up in the 50s and early 60s. And the Red Sox could be losing 7-1 in the bottom of the eighth inning. And if Ted Williams was up at bat, the stadium would, or Fenway Park would, you could hear a pin drop. He was paid so much reverence. So
Mm.
I'd like to have dinner with Ted Williams and Ted Williams and Ted Williams, because I would
What would
want
you
him.
ask him? What would you ask him?
I mean, how did you do it? I mean, one of the stories I tell about Ted Williams that I found in a book, when he was a young kid, he said he only had one goal in life. He wanted to walk down the street and people point to him and says, "There goes the greatest hitter who ever lived." Now, the way
Mm.
it worked out, not only was he the greatest hitter who ever lived, the astronaut John Glenn, who flew with him in Korea, they were in the same battalion. He said Ted Williams might have been the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. And Ted Williams was also a fly fisherman, and some people said that Ted Williams was the greatest fly fisherman who ever lived. So he went to the very, very top at three very disparate activities: hitting a
Wow.
baseball, fly fisherman, and shooting down MiGs or whatever he was shooting down. So I would just want to talk to Ted Williams about is. They once asked him, how do you know when it was time to retire? He said, well, when I used to get up at bat, nothing would interfere. And then one day I get up at bat, and all of a sudden I start thinking about the weeds on my front lawn. He said, I don't know why I was thinking, but all of a sudden I had this interference I never had before.
Hmm. That has to be a really special moment, being at that plate with
Well, let
Fenway.
me tell you another story. So I'm at Fenway Park, and you have to realize we're talking about late 50s, like 59, 60, and I'm 13 years old. And back then, my mom and dad would let me go to Fenway Park with my friends. I mean, there wasn't all this paranoia. And I'm not saying it's not justified paranoia, but I could take the streetcar and I could go to Fenway Park. And of course, I'd get there for batting practice. And of course, I'd stay till the game was over. I never would never leave early. And it was just great. Well, after batting practice, they used to have on the radio the pregame show. And, a certain part of the ballpark, they had the studio set up, and, Ned Martin or Kurt Gowdy would interview somebody. And, I loved it. I just loved it. So one day I'm there, and this guy comes up to me. He said, hey, kid, come over here. He said, who's your favorite ball team? I said, the Red Sox. He said, who's your favorite player? I said, well, Ted Williams, of course. He said, I have a present for you. And he gave me an envelope. And in the envelope, I opened the envelope, is this picture. That's Ted Williams and the greatest hitter who ever lived, and that's Cy Young, the greatest pitcher who ever lived. Now
Wow.
the guy over here, I don't know who this guy is, but that's Ted Williams in the uniform and an old Cy Young. And he tells me that that's Ted Williams and Cy Young, Cooperstown, New York, July 25th, 1955. He said, and I said, well, thank you very much, sir, but why are you giving this to me? I mean, this is old fashioned Kodak.
Sure.
He said, because I could tell that you're the type of kid that's going to hold on to it and treasure it.
Hmm.
And so here we are, say that was 1960. Here we are, and I'm still talking about this picture. So I guess he picked the right person.
Doc, that's the biggest dichotomy in my mind right now. This idea of you not giving anything to your academics, and there's nothing there, but then you had this energy where the guy saw in you that you'd hold on to it, and you still have for all these
Yeah,
years. Question
yeah.
I could ask you is, it, going along the thread that your biggest strength is your biggest weakness, what would you say that is for you? The strength that comes to mind that is your biggest strength, but it's also your greatest weakness.
Okay, well, my biggest weakness as a student is that I was totally unprepared, and I was totally spontaneous, and I just didn't follow the rules. And I'd say probably my biggest strength as a speaker and a teacher is I'm totally unprepared, I'm totally spontaneous, and I don't follow the rules. So I mean, the thrill for me, just like with Free Solo and The Alchemist, I mean, there's a thrill for me to go into a class not knowing what I'm going to talk about, and I have 65 or 75 minutes in front of me, and I've been doing that for 43 years. I literally, I have a syllabus, but I don't follow it. I mean, I literally don't know, and I just, it's just like writers have the muse. I just wait for the muse to tell me what to do. But I'm really not worried because I don't have a PowerPoint, but here's what I do have. I have stories that I've been using. I have hundreds of stories stored in my brain. I have hundreds of games that I play with my students. I have magic tricks that I do. I have interactive exercises. I have friends like you who come to my classes. I mean, so I'm not really without resources.
Right. Well,
I
one
mean,
other thing.
and the truth of the matter is, I could go on for 8 hours, not just an hour and 15 minutes.
What? And I've seen it. I've seen it. I was in your 3 hour course, and I didn't want it to end. And
Yeah.
I'll say you brought it up earlier. You know, if you had perseverance, if you had grit when you were younger, obviously Angela Duckworth's work on grit is exceptional. And when I was speaking to Dr. Nick Molinaro, he added something to it. He said, passion, perseverance, yes, those are two uh, definitely important factors to the grit equation. But he added this last thing, which was a low need for positive reinforcement. And I think that's so important. There's this quote by the late David Foster Wallace, that says you'll stop thinking about what other people think of you when you realize how seldom they do. And that's one of the biggest things that I've had to come to realize is it's very natural, right, from a survival standpoint to think what other people might say, what other people might think in terms of rejection. But I guess what I really appreciate about you is this unpreparedness, this spontaneity, this rule breaking, if you will. And you never needed somebody to clap you on about that, right? You were almost your own biggest cheerleader about that. And I think that is stemming into the peak performance conversation. This idea that you don't always need to be cheered on, right? And I think if you can find something, right, that you're really passionate about, and I guess the skill inside of it is the mental fortitude and the perseverance that you can deliberately work on step by step by step. And then adding that third part, which I think it's integral, is this idea that you're not going to always be cheered upon. In fact, the higher that you climb, the less applause you'll get in the darkness, that is, right? Because you'll be doing less of what makes you just like everybody else. Is that something you would agree with?
Oh, yeah, I mean, if you're motivated by somebody cheering for you, then you're going to be demotivated when they're not cheering for you. And people, I mean, look at The Alchemist and Free Solo. Who is cheering for those people? Nobody. They're all by themselves. Who's cheering for you at 5 in the morning? Nobody. Who was cheering for Shakespeare when he was writing in his writer's garret? I mean, you're 75% of kids drop out of sports by age 14. And one of the reasons is we make sports too big a deal. Why don't you just do it because you love doing it, and then it will be self-motivating. I mean, when you do it because wow, I really like this. I'm not good at it, but I really like chess. And guess what? You'll get good at chess. But if the thing that keeps you playing chess is, wow, I want another ribbon, I
Yeah.
mean, I've been to enough kids' houses that they have these little rooms that it's their own little hall of fame, all their ribbons and banners and this. Oh my God! I mean, and just the fact that they make a big deal out of it is a big deal. I mean, that's not going to get you to the Olympics.
Right.
I don't think people who make it to the Olympics are motivated by the Olympic gold medal. They might think they are. That's not enough to put in all that much work.
Right. I can't remember her name. I was listening to a podcast. She had just won gold for the United States at the Olympics in surfing. And I was listening to it. And I'm really big into the transitive property when I speak, because I want to see how one thing leads to the back end. And what I thought was exceptional, she's out there, right? All the pressure of the world on her, right? She's seeking something she's totally not in control of, which is when's the next great wave going to come? And she's thinking to herself in that moment, wow, how grateful I am just to be out here, right? When everybody else would be like, where's the perfect wave? Where's the perfect wave? Trying to get in front of it. And the transit property that I came up with, because peak performance requires you to be present, is she was so free. And that's what she was describing. She was so free because she chose to be grateful, which just means you just love what you're doing. You're having fun out there, which is just total grace under pressure, right? And the transit property that I came up with was great gratitude equals presence equals freedom. And everybody wants to be free in what they're doing. They don't want to be crippled by the anxieties of the futures, of the stresses of the past. And I just love this. Stop making it such a big deal, right? Stop making it such a big deal. As a professor at heart, Doc, I have to ask you.
Well, let me just add on to that. I don't want anybody to think that you're always in the flow state, because sometimes training is hell. I once went to a book signing at Bookends Bookstore in Ridgewood, New Jersey, with Angelo Dundee, one of the great boxing trainers of all time. And at the end of his little talk, he just came out with his autobiography, and it was time for questions and answers. And I asked him who the hardest working athlete he ever trained was. He thought, oh, that's easy. He said, I've trained hundreds of champions, but nobody ever trained as hard as Muhammad Ali. So I never heard that Ali trained that hard. And I started reading some biographies, and he trained exceptionally hard. And here's one of his quotes. He said, I hated every minute of training. So he said he hated every minute of training. His trainer said he trained harder than anybody else. He said, I hated every minute of training. But I said to myself, don't quit, suffer now, and I could spend the rest of my life as a champion. I hated every minute of training, but I said, don't quit, suffer now, and I could spend the rest of my life as a champion. So I hated every minute of organic chemistry, but I said to myself, don't quit, suffer now, and I could spend the rest of my life as a doctor. You know?
I love that, Doc, and I think that goes along the one of the first things you gave us was school is about diligence, not intelligence, but really life is, right? Because nobody really rolls out the red carpet for you at the late 20s and 30s. So I think finding that discipline and that diligence, because that's what it takes to get up the mountain. The question I was going to ask you was, being a professor at heart, I wanted you to give either a homework assignment or a recommended book for someone that is looking for self-improvement, betterment, and personal development that's listening to this.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, in order, watch Free Solo, then watch The Alchemist, okay? Watch on Netflix The Queen's Gambit. I think there's so much sports psychology in The Queen's Gambit. Listen to my hotline or go to the podcasts that you could hear them all. They're only 3 minutes. They're 3 minutes apiece. And on the podcast, there are hundreds of them there. SuccessHotlinePodcast.com. And you'll hear a lot of stories there. Um, and
How about a book?
Well, probably the best book on sports psychology was probably the first book on sports psychology. It was called The Inner Game of Tennis by Tim Galway. And that hit most of the key things. That's still a great book. And probably the best sports book ever written, The Boys in the Boat. That is like unbelievable. I mean, my whole life is sports. And my 99-year-old mother a few years ago calls me up and said, Robert, I just read a sports book that you should read. And I'm saying to myself, what are the chances my mother knows about a sports book? My mother's not into sports at all. And I said, what's the name of the book? And she said, The Boys in the Boat. I never even heard of it. So
wow.
My mother knew about this before I knew about it.
Right. It's my favorite as well.
Yeah.
Coming to the fourth quarter and the last few questions here, I want to ask you, Doc, what is something that you believe in as a professor or in life that very few people would agree with you on?
Oh, well, first of all, I believe everybody has all the ability they need already inside them, and all they're lacking is a strategy. So every student is a potential superstar, whether it's in school or sports or sales or whatever everybody has all the resources, and all they have to do is develop them by the right training. And the second thing I believe is anybody can be trained to do anything. I really believe that anybody can be trained to do anything.
Is there a question that I didn't ask you that you wish I did?
Yeah. You should say, well, what is this? That's the question. What is this? And I got in the mail one day, and the return address was from you. And I've always wanted to ask you what this was. I never figured it out. You want to tell me? And you want to tell the audience?
Well, for listeners, he's showing the championship net from this last PL championship, and I wanted to send it to Doc because he's been in my corner for years now, and it was so important for me to send him that. But what does that have to do with the question?
Well, this is the greatest gift I've ever received. Of all the thank yous, of all the presents, of all the books I've received, I've never been as touched as I was when I got this. After a while, it didn't really hit me at first what it was. Then when it hit me, I really felt it from my heart. So I want to thank you.
Well, I hope you understand the magnitude in which I care and think about you. But my final question to you would be,
well, the reason it means so much to me is I know the price you paid to get this. And if people don't know this, I don't think any athlete in the world trains as hard as Mark Glicini. And if you know an athlete that trains harder than Mark Glicini, I want to know who it is because I don't think there is a person on the planet that does what he does on a daily basis.
Now I'm gonna have trouble posting this podcast. Thanks for saying that, Doc. You study greatness every day, sun up to sundown. So there's very few people I could ask on this planet that could answer this question better than you. I mean, you brought up Ali, you brought up Ted Williams. What do they all have in common, and how do you know what greatness looks like when you see it?
Well, that's almost an unanswerable question because I don't think it's just one thing. I mean, here you have a guy like Ali that hated training. He he didn't like training, but that freedom you talked about, he had that total freedom to be innovative in the ring. I don't think he planned the rope a dope. Maybe he did, but I don't think he planned the rope a dope weeks in advance. I think he and the trainer came up with it right before, a few days before. But and then you have people who are so regimented, like another one of my heroes, Dan Gable. He was so regimented. So I don't think it's. But I mean, if I were going to say, if there was a gun to my head and you said, I would say the trait is they were willing to do whatever it took. They
Willing?
didn't they well, not willing, eager to do whatever it took. And 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 there was nothing else that limited them. I mean, they wouldn't go home if they had to train more. They wouldn't study if they had to train more. They would, nothing would get in the way of them reaching their goal.
I would be remiss if I didn't end it this way, Doc, and just tell the listeners that when I was going through a fragile time in my life and I walked away from Wall Street, you were a sense of hope and strength for me. I showed up at your doorstep and you really believed in me, not just in terms of mental performance, but you allowed me to come in early before class. You allowed me to stay late. You gave me books every single time I came to see you. You invest so much time in me. And I think I wanted to share that because I hope more people can find Doc Gilberts in their life, because that's really been a source of strength for me as an athlete, but as a person. And thank you very much for carving out the time for this podcast. But thank you very much for everything else as well.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.